northern province of Sahada. The Houthis, who are calling on the Saudis to follow the lead of the Emiratis, who Monday announced a move from a, quote, military first strategy to a peace first strategy. The Emiratis, who as part of the coalition have led the push to chase the Houthis out of the strategic port city of Hodeidah, gateway to much of the country's supply of food and aid. No word on the number of its troops, nor how much the UAE would continue to back the southern separatists since intervention began 4 years ago in the Arab world's poorest nation. For more, let's cross to London and Andreas Krieg, assistant professor at King's College London. Thank you for joining us here on France 24.
Thank you.
What to make of this announcement Monday from the United Arab Emirates?
Well, I mean, it has been foreseen for quite a time that now the Emiratis are trying to draw down some of the troops level that they've had in Yemen. This was a war for the Emiratis that they never really. It was a war of choice. It was the Houthis never really constituted a significant threat to the United Arab Emirates. It was a war which they got drawn into mostly by supporting the Saudi-led effort. And the Emiratis were always more keen to secure their own interests and their own objectives in the south, particularly around Aden, but along the coastal line with the Indian Ocean. And were never too keen to get drawn into the much more difficult, much more costly war in the north with the Houthis, from which they are withdrawing now. So it's important to highlight here what is happening is that the Emiratis are drawing down some of the heavy equipment around the Hodeidah area and bringing it back to the Emirates. That being said, the Emiratis will still maintain some footprint in the south, and they will continue what is essentially a surrogate war, whereby the Emiratis are working with mercenaries, members of the Southern Council, Southern Transitional Council, as well as some tribal factions, of which some have links to Al-Qaeda. So that kind of war will continue in the south because that is directly touching upon vital UAE interest, which is all about access to maritime waterways in the Indian Ocean. The question is just what will it mean for the Saudis, who are now somewhat bogged down in the north? And for the Saudis, they're not in the same luxury position because the Saudis are fighting not a war of choice, but they're fighting a war which for them is about national security. So they don't have the luxury to withdraw as the Emiratis have. So the Emiratis have now their luxury to draw down, remove themselves from Yemen, at least from the north, as much as they can, and call it a day and call it somewhat a successful operation.
Because it's unclear how implicated even now the Emiratis are in Yemen.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, why did they get involved in the first place? I mean, we need to consider this. I mean, the Yemen war was, yes, about an alliance with the Saudis. It was also about obviously showing the Americans that they are a partner that the Americans in the West can work with. But this all came at a cost, and the cost of this war in comparison to 2015 are now immensely high. So the costs are about finances and money. There is cost in blood because the Emiratis have taken quite a lot of casualties in this war, and most importantly, that it's a war that is increasingly connected with political costs in Washington as well, and in the West because the Yemen war is highly unpopular. So by basically withdrawing themselves, they kind of leaving most of the blame for that war on the Saudis, and they can basically retreat and get away with it, which is very, very important because the benefits that this war generates, as I said, is mostly in the south, not really in the north. And it comes with significant costs that now for the Emiratis are no longer justifiable. And let's not forget another aspect of this. The Emiratis are feeling threatened by heightened escalation and heightened tensions with Iran. They feel that they could get drawn into a wider conflict with Iran. And obviously, they don't have that luxury, considering that it's a very small state as well in terms of the military capacity that they have. They don't have the luxury to just have massive troop deployments overseas, when in reality, they might face a potential more severe threat from the north, potentially from Iran and other proxies. So that's another aspect here, why the Emiratis are drawing down from Yemen and putting some of the troops back into their homeland. But as I said, there will be a significant component that will remain in the south.
Some commentators in the Arab world personifying a bit this move, saying it's part of a budding rivalry between the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, and the leader of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ.
Mm. Well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, obviously, this entire war was always a test for this strategic alliance between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and it was always supposed to be a test between Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed in that kind of a relationship where MBZ is playing a mentor role and MBS is playing more of a follower, more of a mentee role. That kind of this kind of relationship was always tested by this particular conflict. We've seen already, not just over the last couple of months, but at least since last year, we've seen that the interest in Yemen between the Saudis and the Emiratis have somewhat diverted. The Saudis are fighting a war for national security against the Houthis, against Iran. The UAE are fighting a war in the south against some extremist elements of Al-Islah that they consider a terrorist organization, but also for their own national interest concerning with access to maritime security. So these two interests somewhat are increasingly less and less overlapping. And in that respect, the MBZ feels like he needs to get out of it. But in that kind of concept, I wouldn't go as far as say in this context that MBZ and MBS are falling out over this. But obviously, this alliance has been stressed, and for the most part, the Saudis are probably realizing now, and they should realize this, that the UAE are in this alliance when it serves their own interest. Now that it serves mostly the Saudi interest, the UAE are withdrawing from it. And that puts a big question mark on the longevity and the resilience of that particular strategic alliance, as they say. But we're still not at a point where we would say this alliance isn't holding, because the UAE will remain part of that coalition and part of this war, which has been fought by surrogates anyway. I mean, let's not forget the Saudis are not fighting this war themselves. For the most part on the ground, they're using Sudanese surrogates and other surrogates, local tribal factions that fight for them, not their own Saudi soldiers. So in that kind of context, much of it can be and will continue to be externalized to other surrogates. But I don't think it will, it will completely undermine that alliance.
Yeah, and what it means going forward for the people of Yemen, in particular, Andreas Krieg, around that strategic Red Sea port of Hodeidah, which was at the center of those negotiations we saw in Sweden at the end of last year.
Yes, I mean, the Sweden deal was, for the Emiratis, was never about humanitarian relief. It was about making sure, and also for the Saudis, by the way, this deal was about trying to have an exit strategy out of a highly unpopular war, for which from the beginning, strategically, neither the Saudis nor the Emiratis had a way out. They thought in 2015 they could get there. They could basically get the Houthis out of Sana'a and kind of win this war very quickly. And now we're into the fifth year of this conflict. Still, there is no military solution inside. The Hodeidah and the Stockholm Agreement was always supposed to be the first political step for them to withdraw. And as I said, for the Emiratis, they're taking the step now. They're saying, we've made this agreement. This agreement has not really been translated effectively yet. If we really look at what this statement was saying, and it kind of applies to Hodeidah only. As soon as you look into the hinterland, we see that much of this arrangement has not been fruitful at all. Human suffering is increasing by the day. It's the worst humanitarian crisis currently in the world. And that's another reason why the Emiratis are trying to get out of it, because they don't want to be associated with that kind of humanitarian crisis. But essentially, it was always supposed to be a bit of window dressing, because both the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition are doing very little to actually implement the Stockholm Agreement. There's a lot of distrust on both sides that has been sown. And now with the Emiratis withdrawing, I think they kind of get out of the shooting line of the Houthis, and now the Houthis can fully concentrate on the Saudis. Which makes it for the Houthis, they feel now empowered and probably say, look, we don't actually have to stick to that agreement, and we'll continue maybe eventually sitting and waiting until we can actually recapture Hodeidah once the Saudis decide to withdraw as well. So it's a game of time whereby I think the Houthis are probably those that are in a more advantaged position.
Andreas Krieg of King's College London, so many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.